The Cathedral of Sorvain had not seen a royal wedding in 40 years. Carved from the bones of the mountain itself, its obsidian pillars stretched toward a ceiling painted with the constellations of the old wolves, and tonight, every seat beneath those ancient stars was filled. 3,000 guests, 14 allied packs, the combined military might of 5 territories, dressed in ceremonial silver and black, pressed shoulder to shoulder in pews that groaned under the weight of political expectation. Cale Draven, Alpha King of the Iron Vast Dominion, stood at the altar. He was everything a king was supposed to be. Tall enough to cast a shadow over lesser wolves, broad enough to fill the ceremonial armor that had been forged for his grandfather, with a jaw that looked as though it had been cut from the same obsidian as the cathedral walls. His dark hair was swept back from his face. His hands were clasped behind him. His eyes stared straight ahead at the high priestess who would bind him to his bride. He looked like a man carved from duty. Behind him, 700 candles burned in iron sconces. Before him, the aisle stretched long and empty, waiting for the woman who would walk it and become his queen. The orchestra of bone flutes had already begun the processional hymn. The doors at the far end of the cathedral had begun to open. And Cale felt nothing. That was the part that terrified him. Not the ceremony, not the political weight of what he was about to do, but the absolute emptiness in his chest where the bond used to live. 8 months ago, that space had been filled with fire. 8 months ago, a woman with dark copper hair and storm-gray eyes had pressed her face into his throat and whispered his name like it was the only word that mattered. 8 months ago, he had held her in the silver grass of the eastern ridge and told her that no treaty, no council, no force in the known territories would ever make him choose anyone but her. Then he had destroyed her. Not with cruelty, not with malice, with something far worse. With silence. With the slow, methodical dismantling of every promise he had made, performed under the crushing pressure of a dying alliance and a war that would have consumed 10,000 lives. The council had given him a choice that was not a choice at all. Marry Ravenna of House Carvosa and secure the southern border, or watch the Ghost Fang raiders pour through the mountain passes and devastate every village, from the Ashenvale to the coast. He had chosen his people, and Serena had vanished. No farewell, no final words. Just an empty chamber, a folded cloak on the bed they had shared, and the severed end of a bond that had once burned so bright it kept him awake at night. She had tried to cut it, he knew, had taken a blade of intent and carved him out of her soul with the same precision she brought to everything she did. The scar it left was not on his skin. It was deeper than that. A hollow ache behind his sternum that pulsed with phantom warmth on nights when the wind carried the scent of rain and iron, the scent he would forever associate with her. Cale had searched for her. For 3 weeks, he had sent wolves to every corner of the Dominion. Then the Ghost Fang raids had begun, and the war demanded every resource, every soldier, every waking moment. The search had been quietly abandoned. Sereni had become a ghost, a memory, a wound he pressed his thumb against in the dark hours before dawn, just to feel something. Now he stood at the altar 8 months later, about to marry a woman he did not love, and he told himself it was enough. Duty was enough. The alliance was enough. The 10,000 lives he had saved were enough. The cathedral doors opened fully, and Ravenna of House Carvosa began her walk. She was beautiful in the way that weapons are beautiful. Sharp cheekbones, pale blonde hair twisted into an elaborate crown of braids, a gown of white wolf silk that caught the candlelight and turned it to liquid gold. Her father, Lord Heron Carvosa, walked beside her with the satisfied expression of a man who had spent 20 years maneuvering his bloodline onto the throne. Ravenna's smile was practiced, perfect, and utterly empty of warmth. Kale watched her approach and felt the hollow in his chest grow wider. The guests rose. The bone flutes swelled. The high priestess raised her hands to invoke the binding words. And then Kale saw her. Not Ravenna. Not the bride walking toward him in white and gold. But a figure standing at the edge of the cathedral, half hidden behind the last pillar of the eastern colonnade, wrapped in a traveling cloak the color of wood smoke. The hood was down. Copper hair caught the candlelight like a struck match. Storm-gray eyes stared at him across the vast hall with an expression that held no anger, no accusation, no plea. Just sorrow. Vast and quiet and final. Serena. Kale's heart stopped. Literally stopped. A single missed beat that sent ice flooding through his veins. His wolf, dormant for months behind walls of grief and discipline, slammed against his ribs with a force that nearly buckled his knees. She was alive. She was here. She was... His eyes dropped from her face to her arms. She was holding a child. A small bundle wrapped in dark fur, cradled against her chest with the careful tenderness of a mother who had been carrying that weight alone for a very long time. The child's face was turned toward Serene's throat, one tiny hand gripping the edge of her cloak. And even from this distance, Kale could see the dark hair on that small head. His dark hair. The world stopped. The bone flutes played. Ravenna continued her walk. The guests watched the ceremony unfold. And Kale Draven, Alpha King of the Iron Vast Dominion, stood at his own altar with his lungs full of shattered glass, staring at the woman he had driven away and the child he never knew existed. Serene's gaze held his for 3 heartbeats. In that silence, he felt something he had not felt in 8 months. The bond. Not the scarred remnant he had grown accustomed to, but a living thread, faint and trembling, reaching toward him from across the cathedral like a hand extended in the dark. She had not destroyed it after all. She had only buried it. Then Serene pulled her hood up, turned away, and began to move toward the doors. She was leaving. Again. She had come to see him one last time, to stand in the shadows and watch him seal his fate with another woman, and now she was walking away, taking his child with her, disappearing into the night exactly as she had done before, except this time he would lose not 1 soul, but 2. Kale looked at Ravenna, who had reached the foot of the altar steps, looked at Lord Carvosa, whose eyes gleamed with triumph, looked at the high priestess, whose hands were still raised, waiting for the groom to step forward and accept his bride. Then he looked back at the pillar where Serene had stood. She was almost at the doors. No. The word came out quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of an alpha command, and every wolf in the cathedral felt it land in their bones. The bone flutes faltered. Ravenna froze on the steps. Lord Carvosa's triumphant expression cracked. No, Kyle said again, louder now. He stepped back from the altar. 1 step, then another. I cannot do this. Kale. The high priestess's voice was sharp with warning. The binding has been invoked. To walk away now is to break sacred covenant. Then it is broken. The cathedral erupted. Gasps, shouts, the scraping of chairs as guests surged to their feet. Lord Carvosa's face twisted from triumph to fury in the span of a single breath. Ravenna stood frozen on the altar steps, her perfect composure shattering as the king turned his back on her before the entire dominion. But Kale was already moving. His ceremonial armor rang against the obsidian floor as he strode down the center aisle, his gaze locked on the doors where a figure in a wood smoke cloak was slipping through the gap. Serene! His voice cracked on her name. He had not spoken it aloud in 8 months. It tasted like blood and honey and the first breath after drowning. She did not stop. Kale ran. The Alpha King of the Iron Vast Dominion, in full ceremonial armor, ran down the aisle of his own wedding like a man whose heart was being ripped from his chest. He burst through the cathedral doors into the frozen courtyard. Snow was falling, thick and silent, blanketing the cobblestones in white. Footprints led across the square toward the market district, already filling with fresh powder. Sereni was 50 yards ahead, walking fast, the child held tight against her body. She did not look back. "Serene, please." She stopped. Not because of the plea in his voice, he realized, but because the child had stirred. The baby's small head turned, and over Serene's shoulder, Kale saw his son's face for the first time. Amber eyes. Unmistakable, undeniable, the exact shade of his own, staring at him with the solemn curiosity of an infant who had never seen his father. Kale's knees hit the cobblestones. He did not decide to kneel. His body simply refused to hold him upright. The snow soaked through his ceremonial trousers. His hands hung at his sides, and the Alpha King knelt in the falling snow and stared at his child with an expression that stripped every layer of power and authority from his face until only the raw, devastated man remained. "How long?" he whispered. Serena finally turned to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady as stone. "He was born 4 months ago, in a village you have never heard of, attended by a midwife who did not know his father's name." "Why did you not tell me?" The question was barely audible. Serena's expression hardened. "Tell you? You made your choice, Kale. You stood in your council chamber and told me that the alliance mattered more than what we had. That the Dominion needed Carvosa's army, not a bondmate with no name and no standing." Her voice did not break, but something behind it fractured. "I did not even know I was carrying your child when I left. I found out alone, in a stranger's village, a month after you discarded me. So do not ask me why I did not tell you. You were not there to tell." The baby made a soft sound, a small, questioning noise that cut through the winter air like a blade. Kale's wolf howled inside him, a sound of recognition and anguish and desperate, clawing need. "His name," Kale said. "Please, tell me his name." Sereni hesitated. For a moment, the hardness in her face wavered, and he caught a glimpse of the woman who had once traced the scars on his chest and called them beautiful. "Kalen," she said quietly. "His name is Kalen." Kalen, a name from the old tongue. It meant born of both shadow and light. "Serene, I was wrong." Kale's voice shook. "I was wrong, and I have spent every day since you left knowing it. The alliance, the war, the council's ultimatum, none of it was worth losing you. None of it." Pretty words from a man who was standing at a wedding altar 30 seconds ago. A wedding I just destroyed, in front of every noble house in the Dominion, in front of the Carvosas and their warriors. Kale laughed, and the sound was ragged. "Do you think I care about any of that? I saw you, Serena. I saw you and our son, and every lie I have been telling myself since you left turned to ash in my mouth." Behind them, the cathedral doors crashed open. Torchlight spilled across the snowy courtyard as voices raised in outrage echoed off the stone buildings. Lord Carvosa's furious bellow rose above the chaos. "The king has broken covenant. This is an act of war." Serene's eyes widened. She clutched Kalen tighter and took a step backward. "Kale, what have you done?" "What I should have done 8 months ago." He rose from his knees. "I chose you. I am choosing you now. And I will keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life, if you will let me." Then the sound of boots on cobblestones reached them. Carvosa soldiers, armed and furious, pouring from the cathedral in pursuit of the king who had just humiliated their house before the world. "We need to move," Serena said, and her voice was no longer soft. It was the voice of a woman who had survived 8 months alone, who had given birth in a stranger's cottage, who had kept a king's heir alive and hidden through winter and war. "Now, Kale. We need to move now." Kale shed his ceremonial armor as they ran, the silver plates clattering against the cobblestones like discarded lies. They cut through the market district, past shuttered stalls and darkened windows. Behind them, the shouts of Carvosa soldiers echoed off the narrow walls. The eastern gate, Sereni said between breaths. There is a passage through the old aqueduct that leads past the outer wall. I used it when I left the first time. How did you find the aqueduct? I spent 6 months living in your castle, Kale. I learned every way in and every way out. A woman with no standing has to know her escape routes. They reached the eastern wall as the first howls rose behind them. The Carvosa wolves were shifting, abandoning their human forms to hunt with speed and scent. Sereni pressed herself against a section of wall overgrown with dead ivy and pushed. A stone panel ground inward, revealing a narrow tunnel that smelled of damp earth and old water. She slipped through with practiced ease, cradling Kalen against her chest. Kale followed, his broader frame scraping against the ancient stones. Behind them, the howling grew louder. The tunnel opened into a frozen streambed on the far side of Sorvain. They ran through the darkness for another hour before Sereni led them to a hunter's cabin tucked into the base of a granite ridge. I stayed here on my way out of Sorvain, she said. The first time I fled. We can rest until dawn. Within minutes, she had a fire burning, Kalen settled in a makeshift nest of furs, and water heating in a battered iron pot. Kale stood in the doorway and watched her, feeling useless in a way he had never experienced as a king. You have done this alone, he said quietly. All of it. The pregnancy, the birth, raising him. Yes. Serena did not look up from the fire. You should not have had to. Now she looked at him. The firelight illuminated the shadows beneath her eyes, the sharpness of her cheekbones that spoke of meals skipped so the baby could eat. The quiet ferocity of a woman who had forged herself into something unbreakable because the alternative was to shatter. No, she agreed. I should not have. But I did. And I would do it again, because he is worth every cold night and every hungry morning and every moment I spent wondering if his father even remembered I existed. Kale looked at his son, at the tiny fingers that curled and uncurled in the firelight. Something vast and terrifying and beautiful opened inside his chest, a love so immediate and so complete that it rewrote every priority he had ever held. He had chosen a kingdom over this. Get some sleep, Kyle, Sereni said. Tomorrow will be worse. She was right about that too. They traveled for 3 days to reach Mireth Vale, the settlement where Sereni had been living. Sereni led them south along game trails that wound through dense pine forest. She moved with the certainty of someone who had walked these paths many times, adjusting Kalen's weight against her body with practiced ease. Kale followed 2 paces behind. He noticed things about her that the chaos of the previous night had not allowed him to see. She was thinner than he remembered. Her wrists were narrow, her collarbones pronounced beneath the rough-spun fabric of her dress. She had been feeding the baby at the expense of feeding herself. But she was also stronger. There was a hardness in her stride that had not existed before. A set to her jaw that spoke of decisions made alone in the dark, of a woman who had learned to be her own fortress because the man who should have protected her had failed. It was Kale who broke the silence first. You came to the wedding. Why? Sereni continued walking for another 30 paces before she spoke. Because I needed to see it. I needed to watch you marry her so that I could finally kill whatever part of me was still waiting for you to come. The honesty of it was devastating. And instead, I ruined everything, Kale said. You did not ruin everything. You complicated everything. She glanced back at him. Ruin is final. Complication can be survived. I have become very good at surviving complications. On the second day, they rested on a flat rock while Sereni tended to Kalen. Kale watched her murmur reassurances in a voice so tender it made something in his throat close tight. She was an extraordinary mother, and she had become one entirely without him. "Can I hold him?" The words were out before Kale could stop them. Something flickered across her face. Fear. Protectiveness. The instinctive resistance of a woman who had been the only arms her child had ever known. "Please," Kale added. The word cost him more than any command he had ever given. Sereni hesitated. Then, slowly, she placed Kalen in his arms. The weight of his son settled against his chest, and Kale forgot how to breathe. Kalen was so small, so impossibly, terrifyingly small. The baby looked up at him and made a soft, exploratory sound, as if trying to understand this new set of arms. Kale's wolf surged forward, pressing against his skin from the inside. A low, involuntary rumble built in his chest, the sound an alpha makes when it meets its offspring for the first time. A declaration of recognition, of protection. Kalen's eyes widened. Then, to Kale's astonishment, the baby smiled. It was the first smile Serena had not been the cause of. "He knows you," Sereni said quietly. "I do not know how, but he knows you." Kale could not speak. He held his son against his heart and felt the world rearrange itself around this single, irreducible truth. A tear fell onto Kalen's blanket. Then another. The Alpha King wept in silence, holding his son for the first time while the woman he loved watched with an expression that was equal parts grief and guarded hope. Mireth Vale sat at the edge of the known world, a scatter of thatched roofs clinging to the banks of a shallow river, populated by humans and unaligned wolves who did not ask questions. Sereni's cottage was small, a single room with a loft, a stone hearth, a cradle made of bent willow lined with rabbit fur. Kale stood in the center and understood, with painful clarity, what her life had looked like. The single plate and cup on the shelf. The narrow bed in the loft where she slept alone. The mended dress hanging from a hook, stitched so many times the original fabric was almost gone. She had built this from nothing while he sat on a throne. "Stop looking at everything like that," Serene said, placing Kalen in his cradle. "I do not need your pity." "It is not pity. It is shame, Serene. Because you deserve none of this, and I deserve none of you." A knock at the door interrupted them. An older woman named Dagny, all weather-lined skin and sharp knowing eyes, carried in a steaming pot of stew. "Heard you had company, Wren." She peered past Serene at Kael. "Thought you said your man was dead?" "I thought he was," Serene replied evenly. "Turns out I was mistaken." Dagny studied Kael with blunt assessment. "He looks like trouble." "He is." Well, eat something, both of you. You look half-starved, and he looks like he has been crying." 3 days passed in quiet domesticity that felt like borrowed time. Kale learned the rhythms of fatherhood. Kalen woke twice in the night and would only settle if held upright against a shoulder. Sereni sang to the baby in a language he did not recognize. She slept with a knife under her pillow. On the second morning, Kale spent 3 hours alone with his son while Serena went to the river. He held him, fed him, changed his wrappings with clumsy hands that had commanded armies, but had never handled something so delicate. And when Kalen gripped his finger with surprising strength, Kale made a promise to the empty room. "I will never leave you," he whispered, "and I will spend the rest of my life earning the right to say that." On the third evening, the news arrived. A trader passed through Mireth Vale with word from the wider world. The Iron Vast Dominion was in chaos. The Alpha King had walked out of his own wedding. Lord Carvosa had declared blood feud and seized the royal treasury. Half the noble houses called the king a madman and an oath-breaker. But that was not the worst of it. Without the king, the Ghost Fang raiders had broken through the southern passes. 3 villages burned in 2 days. The border was collapsing, and Carvosa had offered 5,000 gold for information leading to the king's capture, dead or alive. Back in the cottage, Sereni turned on him with an expression that mixed fury with fear. 3 villages, Kale. 3 villages burned because you walked away from that altar. I know. People are dying. Your people. The people you told me you chose over us. I know, Serena. So what are you going to do about it? Before he could answer, a sharp knock rattled the door. Not a neighbor's knock. The hard, urgent knock of someone who had traveled far and fast. Open the door, you stubborn fool. The voice on the other side was female, rough with exhaustion and achingly familiar. I have been walking for 2 days, and if you make me break this door down, I will add it to the very long list of things I am furious with you about. Felice Renmore, commander of the King's Fang and the only wolf in the Dominion Kale trusted with his life, pushed past him into the cottage. She looked as though she had crawled through a war. A gash across her left cheekbone had been crudely stitched. She carried a battered dispatch case under one arm. She stared at the sleeping baby for a long moment. Well, that explains quite a lot. Thalise opened her dispatch case and pulled a sealed letter stamped with the crossed fangs of the Ghost Fang Confederacy. This was intercepted by our border scouts. It was being carried to Lord Carvosa. The message inside was brief and devastating. The terms of our agreement are accepted. The southern passes will be opened on the night of the broken wedding. Your forces will stand down. In exchange, the Ghost Fang Confederacy recognizes House Carvosa as the legitimate ruling house of the Iron Vast Dominion. The Wolf King and his bloodline are to be eliminated. No heirs, no survivors. Kyle read the letter 3 times because his mind refused to accept what his eyes were telling him. Carvosa made a deal with the Ghost Fangs, he said. The raids on the border villages were not a failure of the Alliance. They were part of the plan. The Carvosas never intended to protect the southern border, Thalise confirmed. They manufactured the Ghost Fang threat to force your hand into the marriage, and when you walked away from the altar, they activated the second phase. Let the raiders through. Blame the destruction on your absence. Seize power in the chaos. Sereni spoke slowly. Those people died because Carvosa opened the gates. Yes. Kale stood with the letter in his hands, and something inside him that had been frozen since Sereni's departure began to thaw. Not warmth, not hope. Something far more dangerous. Rage. He had sacrificed Serena to secure an alliance with a house that had been conspiring with his enemies from the beginning. They had used his own sense of duty as the weapon to destroy him. He had not chosen his people over Seren. He had been manipulated into destroying both. The letter mentions his bloodline, Thalise added quietly. No heirs, no survivors. They know about the child. Sereni moved between Thalise and the cradle, knife raised, her body a shield. No one touches him. Thalise raised both hands. I am on your side, Seren. That is why I walked 2 days through enemy territory instead of sending a messenger who could be intercepted. She withdrew a second letter, sealed with the blue wax of House Drenmore. 11 noble houses have refused to recognize Carvosa's claim. They are waiting for their king. All they need is proof that he has not gone mad. And what would constitute proof? A true mate and a legitimate heir. Show them you walked away from that altar out of love, not madness, and they will follow you into the fire. We go back, Kale said. We take back the throne. Dawn, Thalise replied. The Carvosa hunters will reach Mireth Vale within 2 days. We need to be gone before they arrive. Serena looked at Kyle. Then she picked up Kaelin and began to pack. They left before first light, Thalise leading them northeast toward the Ashenmere crossing, where a loyalist escort would guide them to Drenmore Keep. They had been walking for 4 hours when Thalise stopped and pressed her palm to the frozen earth. Riders, she said. 6, maybe 8, coming from the northwest. Unshod hooves. Ghost fangs, Kyle said. Carvosa is using them as hunting dogs, Serena said flatly. He sends his own men along the main roads. The ghost fangs go through the wild country where no one is watching. There was no outrunning mounted raiders with a baby. Sereni's hand found Kale's arm. There is a ravine a quarter-mile east, narrow entrance, rock walls on 3 sides. I passed it on my way to Mareth Vale months ago. You remember terrain from 8 months ago? Thalise asked. I remember every piece of ground between here and Sorvain. A woman alone with a newborn remembers escape routes the way soldiers remember battlefields. They reached the ravine just as the sound of hooves became audible through the trees. It was exactly as Seren had described. A narrow slash in the granite, barely wide enough for 2 wolves abreast, with sheer walls rising 15 feet on either side. The back ended in a jumble of boulders that formed a natural shelter. Serena tucked herself behind the boulders with Kaelin, her knife drawn, her body curved around the baby like a shell. Kale and Thalise positioned themselves at the ravine mouth. Like the Coldwater Pass, Thalise said, referencing a battle they had fought together 3 years ago. Except this time, the stakes are slightly higher. Slightly, Kale agreed. The ghost fangs arrived in a thunder of hooves. 8 riders with ash-painted faces carrying weapons designed to kill wolves. Silver-tipped spears. Wolfsbane-soaked nets. Their leader, a broad man with teeth filed to points, studied the ravine with predatory calm. The Carvosa lord said there would be a woman and a child. He said nothing about a king and his guard. Then the Carvosa lord underestimated us, Kale replied. It would not be the first time. The leader grinned. Dead or alive, the bounty pays the same. Makes no difference to me. He raised his hand. 6 riders surged forward, 2 dismounting to approach on foot while the others circled to search for alternate routes through the rock. Kale shifted. The transformation was faster than it had ever been. One heartbeat he was human, the next he was wolf. Massive and black-furred, his body filling the ravine entrance like a living gate. His wolf roared with savage joy at finally being released after months of suppression. Thalise shifted behind him, a lean gray wolf of surgical precision. The first 2 ghost fangs made it 3 steps into the ravine. Kale met them like an avalanche. His jaws found the first man's spear shaft and snapped it like dry kindling. His shoulder drove the second into the rock wall with a crack that echoed off the granite. But the ghost fangs were not amateurs. They had killed wolves before. The remaining riders dismounted and advanced in formation, silver-tipped spears forming a bristling wall. One hurled a wolfsbane net that spread like a dark web across the ravine mouth. Kale twisted to avoid it, but the net caught his hind leg. The wolfsbane burned through his fur like acid. He ripped free, but the moment of imbalance cost him. A spear tip scored a line of fire along his ribs. Thalise took a wound to the shoulder. They were holding the entrance, but barely. And the Ghost Fang leader had not yet entered the fight, standing at the tree line, waiting for the wolves to exhaust themselves. Behind them, in the shelter of the boulders, Kaelin began to cry. The sound cut through the chaos like a blade. Every wolf instinct in Kale's body screamed at him to get between the threat and his pup. He lunged forward, driving the spearman back with sheer ferocity. And then, something else happened. Something impossible. The baby howled. A 4-month-old infant, far too young to shift, far too young to produce any sound resembling a wolf's call, was howling from his mother's arms with a voice that resonated against the granite walls and multiplied into something vast. And Serena was glowing. Kale could see it from the ravine mouth. A faint luminescence emanating from where she crouched behind the boulders, growing brighter with each passing second. Not golden like healing magic or silver like moonlight. This was copper, the color of her hair, the color of autumn leaves and forge fire, and it pulsed in rhythm with the baby's impossible howl. Sereni had never been a shifter. She had never shown any sign of wolf blood. She was human-born, common-born, a woman of no supernatural lineage whatsoever. That was what the council had used to justify separating her from Kale. That was what made her, in their eyes, unworthy of a king. But something was happening now that defied every rule Kale had ever been taught about bloodlines and power and what was supposed to be possible. The copper light blazed outward from the boulders. It hit the ravine walls and raced along the granite like liquid fire, filling every crack and crevice. The Ghost Fang raiders stumbled backward, shielding their eyes. Their horses screamed and bolted. Sereni stepped out from behind the boulders, Kaelin in one arm, her free hand raised, copper light pouring from her palm. Her gray eyes had changed. They burned with amber fire. "You will not touch my child," she said, and her voice carried harmonics that shook loose stones from the walls. "You will not touch his father. Leave this place, or I will bury you in it." The Ghost Fang leader sheathed his sword. "The Carvosa lord did not pay us enough for this." He turned and walked away, and his men followed without a word. As the light faded, Sereni collapsed into Kale's arms. "What was that?" he breathed. Thalise, shifting back with a grunt of pain, answered for her. "Mate transference. Old stories say that when a true bond forms between a wolf and a human, the human absorbs a piece of the wolf's essence over time. The pregnancy must have accelerated it." They bound their wounds and pressed on. As they walked, something shifted between Kale and Sereni. Not forgiveness, but a rearrangement of the distance between them, as if the battle had reminded them both what they were willing to fight for. "You stood in front of them," Kale said quietly as they descended a wooded slope. "You walked out of cover with our son in your arms and faced 6 armed raiders. They were going to kill you. And that mattered to you?" Serena was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the crunch of their boots and the distant murmur of the river. "It has always mattered to me," she finally said. "That is the part I cannot forgive you for, Kale. Not that you chose your kingdom. I understood that. I hated it, but I understood it. What I cannot forgive is that you made me love someone who was capable of walking away from me. Because that means I am capable of being left, and I do not know how to stop fearing it." The words opened a wound he did not know how to close. "I will not walk away again," he said. "You cannot promise that. You are a king. Kings are made of choices, and every choice has a cost." "Then I promise this instead." Kale stopped walking and turned to face her. Thalise had moved ahead, giving them space with the unsubtle tact of a soldier who had seen too many commanders try to lead with a broken heart. "I promise that whatever choice I make, for the rest of my life, you and Kaelin will be standing on the same side of it as me. No more decisions that separate us. No more sacrifices that cost me the people I love. If the kingdom demands a price I am not willing to pay, then the kingdom will have to find another way." Sereni searched his face. Beneath the wariness that months of solitude had etched into her bones, something flickered. Not trust. Not yet. But the willingness to consider it. "We will see," she said. And for the first time since the cathedral, the hardness in her voice softened by a single, barely perceptible degree. They crossed the Ashenmere at dusk. The river was wide and dark, its surface sheeted with thin ice. On the far bank, torches burned in a ragged line. A flat-bottomed barge pulled by 2 enormous wolves glided toward them through the broken ice. Kaelin watched the dark water with wide eyes, one hand gripping Sereni's hair and the other reaching toward the ice as if trying to touch the moonlight on its surface. Kale stood beside them, close enough that his shoulder touched Sereni's, and she did not pull away. On the far bank, they were met by 11 wolves in the armor of 11 different houses, standing in formation despite the cold. At their head stood Oriane Drenmore, the elderly matriarch of the oldest military house in the Dominion. 73, silver-haired, and built like a siege tower. She had fought in 3 wars, buried 2 husbands, and once broken a rival lord's jaw at a peace summit. She looked at Kale, then at Sereni, then at the baby. "So, This is what pulled you off that altar. This is everything, Kale said simply. Orion studied Soren. You are the one they call common-born. I am the one who kept your king's heir alive for 8 months while the rest of you played politics. A silence stretched across the riverbank. Thalys bit back what might have been a laugh. Then Orion Drenmore smiled. It was a small, fierce smile. Good. A queen should have teeth. They rode through the night toward Drenmore Keep. Kale and Soreni shared a horse. Kaelin nestled between them. The column of loyalist wolves moved in tight formation. As they rode, Thalys briefed them. Lord Carvosa had seized the royal chambers. Ravenna had been named regent queen. Ghostfang mercenaries patrolled the capital streets. But Captain Maddock held a resistance cell of 200 loyal wolves hidden in tunnels beneath the citadel. The common people despise Carvosa, Thalys reported. He raised taxes within a day of seizing the treasury, and his decision to station Ghostfang raiders inside the capital walls has terrified the population. These are the same raiders who burned their border villages. Now they are guarding the palace gates. And Carvosa was holding a coronation in 3 days, planning to crown Ravenna as queen and destroy every official record of Kale's reign: birth records, treaty documents, bloodline registries. He is erasing our son's birthright, Soreni said, and something new entered her voice. Not just willingness to fight, but the burning need to. This was no longer about their broken relationship or his failures or her exile. This was about their son's future. And on that ground, they stood together without hesitation. Drenmore Keep materialized from the darkness like a clenched fist of stone. Inside, Kale found his allies assembled in the great war room: 14 commanders, 60 veteran warriors, and a map of the capital smuggled out through the tunnel network. It was not an army. Against Carvosa's combined forces, it was barely a raiding party. But it was all they had. The plan was audacious. Maddox's cell would open the eastern tunnels at dawn on the 3rd day. 3 groups. 1 to secure the archives, 1 to take the armory, and the 3rd, led by Kale, would enter the throne hall during the coronation and challenge Carvosa's claim. If you walk into that throne hall, I walk in with you, Soreni said. Kaelin and I are not your weakness. We are your proof. The morning of the 3rd day broke cold and clear. Kale stood at the window of the chamber he had been given and watched the first light. In a few hours, he would either reclaim his throne or die trying. Behind him, Soreni stirred. They had slept in the same room for the first time since her exile, though not in the same bed. Kale had taken the floor without being asked. But when she rose and began preparing Kaelin, he noticed something. She was humming. The same wordless melody she sang to the baby at night. And her body, usually rigid with hypervigilance, was softer. As if, for the first time since her exile, she was allowing herself to exist in a moment rather than bracing for the next catastrophe. Kale. Her voice stopped him at the door. He turned. If something goes wrong today, she said, adjusting Kaelin's wrappings with careful hands, I need you to know something. Serena. I came to that cathedral to say goodbye. I had decided to cut the last thread of the bond and raise Kaelin without ever telling him who his father was. She looked up, and her eyes were luminous. But when I saw you standing at that altar, looking like a man already dead, I could not do it. Even after everything, I could not stop wanting to save you. Kale crossed the room. He stood before her, close enough to touch but not touching, because the choice had to be hers. You did save me, he said. You have been saving me since the moment we met, and I have been too blind and too afraid and too devoted to a duty built on lies to see it. A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away, an impatient gesture, as if the emotion was an inconvenience she could not afford. Win today, she said. Win, and come back to us. Then we will see about the rest. The eastern tunnels smelled of damp stone and ancient water. 60 wolves moved in disciplined silence through passages beneath the citadel. Sereni walked at the center of the column with Kaelin against her chest, flanked by Drenmore guards. She had refused armor, arguing that a woman in a simple dress carrying a baby would be treated as a statement, not an invader. The throne hall doors stood wide open because Lord Carvosa wanted the entire capital to witness his daughter's coronation. Kael stepped through those doors alone. The silence was absolute. 500 wolves realized a dead man was standing in the doorway. On the dais, Lord Carvosa stood frozen beside Ravenna, who knelt before the high priestess with the iron crown hovering above her head. "That crown," Kael said, and his voice filled the hall like thunder, "does not belong to her." "Seize him!" Carvosa roared. "He is a traitor!" Kael did not shift, he did not fight. He held up the intercepted Ghostfang letter. "This is a signed agreement between Lord Carvosa and the Ghostfang Confederacy. It confirms that the Carvosa family deliberately opened the southern passes. The raids that burned your villages were not a failure of defense. They were deliberate sabotage, designed to force my hand into a marriage that would put Carvosa blood on the throne." "Lies!" Carvosa snarled. "A forgery!" "Then let the assembled houses examine the letter. Let the seal be tested. I have nothing to hide. Do you?" And then, Sereni walked through the doors. She entered with Kaelin in her arms and 4 Drenmore guards at her back. No crown, no jewels, just the simple dress of a village healer and a cloak the color of wood smoke. Her copper hair fell loose around her shoulders. "This is Serena," Kael said, and the tenderness in his voice made several wolves in the front rows look away. "She is my true mate. I did not walk away from that altar out of madness. I walked away because I saw the woman I love holding the son I never knew I had, and I understood that no crown is worth losing them." Sereni climbed the dais steps and stood beside him. "I am not noble-born," she said, her voice carrying to every corner. "I have no army, no treasury, no alliances. What I have is a child who deserves to know his father. A bond that 2 kingdoms tried to destroy and could not. And the truth, which is that the man beside me tore apart his own life to find us, while the man behind that crown conspired with your enemies to build a throne from your suffering." She turned to face Carvosa. "You sent raiders to burn villages so my mate would be forced to marry your daughter. You planned to erase his bloodline and eliminate his heir. He is not the one who made a deal with the wolves who destroyed your own people." Lord Carvosa drew his sword. "Enough. Guards, seize them, all of them, the woman and the child too." The order fell into the hall like a stone into a frozen lake. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The Carvosa guards looked at each other. They looked at the king, standing unarmed and unafraid. They looked at the woman holding the baby with copper fire still fading in her eyes. And they looked at the letter with its damning seal. Then, one by one, they lowered their weapons. Not all of them. The 15 true Carvosa loyalists tightened their grips and stepped forward with the desperate commitment of wolves who knew they had no future beyond this room. But the rest, the wolves from minor houses who had sided with Carvosa because they thought the king was never coming back, stepped aside. Some knelt. Others simply dropped their swords and walked away from the dais. "No!" Ravenna shrieked. She lunged for the crown still resting on the high priestess's cushion. Her fingers closed around the cold iron. "This is mine. He chose me at the altar." "He chose nothing," Serena said quietly. "He chose absence and emptiness, and a life that would have hollowed him to the bone. I watched it happen. I saw his face at that altar, and there was no choice in those eyes. Only surrender." She looked at Ravenna with an expression that held no hatred, only a terrible, precise understanding. "You would have been queen of a man already dead inside. Is that truly what you wanted?" Ravenna screamed and hurled the crown at Sereni. Kale moved. His arm blurred between human and wolf, catching the iron crown an inch from Serene's face. She had not flinched, had not closed her eyes, had simply stood her ground with their son against her chest and trusted that Kale would be where he needed to be. Trust. Real trust. Given freely, in the moment that mattered most. The bond between them erupted. It did not require a ritual or a ceremony. It simply happened, the way dawn happens, inevitable and complete. The buried thread blazed to life, and Kale felt her consciousness pour into his like a river breaking through a dam. He saw 8 months through her eyes, the morning sickness endured alone, the 19-hour labor in a stranger's cottage. The first time Kalen opened his eyes, and she saw Kale's face staring back at her from their son's features. The nights she sobbed with her fist pressed to her mouth so no one would hear. The mornings she rose anyway, because the baby needed her, and need was a stronger force than grief. He felt her love, not the bright, uncomplicated love of their early days, but something deeper and harder, and infinitely more durable. A love that had survived betrayal, exile, poverty, loneliness, and the constant temptation to let it die. A love that had been tested in every way imaginable and had refused, stubbornly and furiously, to stop. And she felt him. The nights he had stood at the window pressing his hand to the hollow in his chest. The meeting where the council had presented the Carvosa ultimatum and he had argued for 3 days before capitulating. The moment he entered her empty chamber and found the folded cloak and understood, with devastating finality, that she was gone. The grief that had turned him into a man walking through his own life like a ghost inhabiting a body it no longer recognized. She felt his love for Kalen, instantaneous and overwhelming, and the promise he had whispered in the empty cottage. "I will never leave you." And she believed him. The hall felt it. 500 wolves stood in the resonance of a completed true mate bond, undeniable and rare, and impossible to forge or fabricate. Every creature in that room felt its truth in their bones. Orion Drenmore was the first to kneel, then the wolves of the 11 loyal houses. Then, like a tide, the rest of the hall followed. Minor house lords who had backed Carvosa dropped to one knee. Common wolves along the walls bowed their heads. Even a handful of former Carvosa guards lowered themselves to the stone floor. Lord Carvosa stood alone on the dais, sword still drawn, surrounded by his 15 remaining loyalists, and the slowly growing realization that his coup had died in the space of 10 minutes. "Heron Carvosa," Kale said, "you conspired with the enemies of the Iron Vast Dominion. You sought to destroy my mate and erase my heir from existence. You are responsible for every life lost in the Ghost Fang raids you invited upon our own people. You will face the judgment of the assembled houses. Your lands are forfeit. Your house is dissolved." Carvosa's sword arm trembled. His eyes darted to the exits, calculating, searching for an escape that did not exist. The Carvosa loyalists dropped their weapons. The last of them, a young wolf who could not have been more than 17, looked at Kale with terrified eyes. "I did not know," the boy said, "about the ghost fangs, about any of it, I swear." Kale studied him for a long moment. "Then you have a chance to build something better than what your lord tried to destroy. Do not waste it." The boy knelt with tears streaming down his face. It was Seren who picked up the crown. She held it out to Kyle, not placing it on his head, simply offering, freely, without condition. Kale took the crown and set it gently on the altar beside them. "Not yet," he said. "Not until every village is rebuilt. Not until the kingdom is worthy of the crown and the crown is worthy of the people who carry it." Kalen, nestled between them, reached for his father's jaw and gripped it with one tiny fist. Kale laughed, a sound so unexpected that it echoed through the silent hall like music. "My queen," he said softly. I have not agreed to that yet, Serene replied. But the corner of her mouth twitched, and in her eyes, something that had been locked away for 8 months finally came home. In the weeks that followed, the Iron Vast Dominion began to heal. Lord Carvosa was tried before the assembled houses and condemned for treason. Ravenna was stripped of her name and exiled to the eastern wastes, where the wind never stopped, and the wolves who lived there answered to no one. The Ghost Fang Confederacy retreated behind the southern passes, and the border villages began to rebuild with timber and gold sent from the royal treasury. The 11 loyal houses became the core of a new council, one that included, for the first time in the Dominion's history, representatives from the common-born population. Serena had insisted on this. Kale had agreed without hesitation. Thalise was promoted to Marshal of the King's Fang. She accepted the honor by grunting, asking if the position came with better boots, and going back to reorganizing the border defenses. Maddock retired to a cottage by the sea, finally allowing himself the rest he had been refusing for 30 years. Serene became queen on a spring morning, 3 months after the battle for the throne hall. The ceremony was small. No cathedral, no bone flutes, no 3,000 guests, just the inner court, the 11 house leaders, and a circle of wildflowers on the eastern ridge where Kale had once held her in the silver grass and made promises he thought he could not keep. She wore a simple dress. No crown. The iron crown sat on a cushion beside them, waiting. But she had told Kale she would not wear it until she was ready, and he had told her there was no rush. It was Kalen who decided the moment. The boy, now 7 months old, crawled across the grass toward the cushion, grabbed the crown with both hands and held it up toward his mother with the determined expression of an infant who had made an important decision. Serene laughed. The sound broke across the ridge like sunlight through storm clouds, and Kale realized it was the first time he had heard her truly laugh since before everything fell apart. She took the crown from her son's hands and placed it on her own head. Well, she said, looking at Kale with eyes that held no more walls, no more armor, no more buried bonds. Just love. Vast and complicated and scarred and absolutely indestructible. I suppose that settles it. Kale pulled her close, careful of the crown, careful of the baby, careful of nothing else in the entire world. I love you, he said. The words he should have spoken 1,000 times. The words he should have screamed from that altar instead of saying no. The words he would spend the rest of his life saying until they were so woven into the fabric of their story that no one would ever doubt they were true. I love you, Soren. I have loved you since the Eastern Ridge. I loved you through the silence and the war and the empty rooms and the 8 worst months of my existence. And I will love you past the end of everything, because you are the only choice I have ever made that was entirely, irrevocably right. Serene kissed him, not gently, not tentatively, with the full force of a year's worth of grief and fury and longing and the stubborn, unbreakable love of a woman who had carried a king's child through winter and exile and emerged not broken but forged. When they finally parted, Kalen was clapping his small hands with delighted enthusiasm, as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment his entire short life. Below the ridge, the wolves of the Iron Vast Dominion lifted their voices, a chorus of howls that rose from the valley and the forests and the distant mountains, carrying across the territories like a declaration written in sound. Their king had come home. Their queen had risen from nothing. And the child who had brought them back together, the hidden pup whose amber eyes had stopped a king at his own altar, watched it all with the quiet certainty of a soul that had always known exactly where it belonged. They had lost each other. They had found each other. And in the finding, they had become something stronger than either of them had been alone. It was not a perfect ending, but it was theirs. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story.